Well, today we're going to look at a summary of chapter 2 of Romans. I put up to chapter 1 summary, so you should be able to access it already on Facebook. I haven't put it up into YouTube yet, but I'll send out a link to everyone. It seems like texting out the links works better, so I'll do that, and I will send out an email as well. All right, chapter 1, Paul introduces the universal problem. And the universal problem for humanity is everyone separated from God due to sin. And he goes into explaining the consequences of that. Those being that when people reject the revelation of God they've been given, and he talks about in creation, that's what we call general revelation, that when people reject that, God turns them over to something else. And the something else he turns them over to includes a reprobate mind. And a reprobate mind is a mind that is unreliable when it comes to what we might call common sense or even spiritual things. Now, you may be very intelligent, but unreliable is probably one of the best ways to define it. So they're turned over to a reprobate mind. Also, the human race was turned over to what we call the fallen nature or fallen sin nature. Paul just simply calls it the flesh. Now, in chapter 1, he doesn't call it the flesh. He calls it being turned over to the wicked desires of the heart. And he goes into several of those. But we'll just, for the sake of simplicity, say he's talking about being turned over to the flesh or to our fallen nature. So he closes chapter 1 very bleak, and that is making the case that everyone is in need of salvation. All right, so then in chapter 2, he deals with the issue that we could say a possible rebuttal, though it's not exactly clear that's what he's doing. But he deals with the issue of those who would read his letter who would say that doesn't pertain to them. And that would be someone who not only thought what he wrote didn't pertain to them, but that others were of lesser value than they were because they felt like others were more guilty of the things he points out in chapter 1. And so I wrote down just a kind of a brief summary, and I'm going to share that with you today just for simplicity's sake. Paul concluded chapter 1 with the verdict that all people have the universal problem of separation from God due to sin. However, Paul understood that some thought they were better than others and made a practice of judging others. His fellow Jews, for example, had a bias against Gentiles. They assumed that Gentiles were lower than them because they were polytheist, immoral, and they considered them to be like dogs or animals. But Paul opens chapter 2 with, "You therefore have no excuse, you who pass judgment on someone else, for at whatever point you judge another, you are condemning yourself." Now, I think this is an important part that he adds on here that sometimes gets overlooked, and overlooked to the point that we misinterpret the passage, and that's unfortunate. But he said, at whatever point you judge another, you are condemning yourself, not because you judge what they're doing, although judging we're not supposed to do, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But he said you're placing judgment on yourself because you are condemning them for things that you're doing. You're doing the same thing. And so he's talking about judging out of hypocrisy. So what it would be like, Paul asks, why would you do such things, condemning others when one is guilty of doing the same? is an invitation for judgment or for the judgment of God. A woman once told my father that she could not understand why people had car accidents. And then she accused people of having car accidents of being ignorant, not paying attention, being less of a driver than she was, that she had driven for over 20 years and had never had an accident. And if other folks would be just as careful and aware as she was, they wouldn't be having accidents either. And after saying that, she put her car in reverse, hit the gas, and ran into her husband's work truck sitting in the yard. And so there went her record, clear record, right out the window. And a lot of times that's what happens. We judge well, I use the word judge, but we just say criticize. We criticize other people for something that maybe we ourselves are guilty of too, and then wonder why that thing gets turned around on us. It would be like me criticizing someone for being fat. That would be so easy to turn that around on me. It would be pitiful. So what is he saying here? Is he making a big statement about not judging others? Not really. What he's getting at is the point that the people he's talking to here are people who assume they are better than what they are. They assume that they are superior to others. They assume they are not part of the universal problem. So, let's move on. Jesus said not to judge, lest we be judged in the Sermon on the Mount. What does judge mean? It's a good question. The word stands for one who is judge, jury, and executioner. We are not to judge when we are guilty too. Now, does that mean we should not correct or inspect the fruit in a person's life? No. It means that we keep the right attitude and do as Paul recommended in Galatians when restoring a brother. Do so with humility, considering yourself, lest you be tempted. Paul stated that rather than judging, they should be rejoicing in God's kindness, forbearance, and patience. Why? God's kindness is his conviction of our sin that leads to repentance, rather than condemnation for our sin. The difference is that conviction offers a way to deal with the problem, while condemnation offers no hope. Paul points out that these readers who thought they were better in the eyes of God were stubborn and unrepentant, and as a result were storing up wrath against themselves. And God would repay them for their sin if they did not repent. Possession of the law does not give one an advantage with God. Possession of the law makes one more accountable for their behavior. Paul stresses the point, for God does not show favoritism. Paul's position was having the law does not remove the universal problem, just as not having the law of God does not give people an excuse for living in sin. Paul contends that the essence of the law is written in the hearts of those who do not have the written law. Paul alludes to the role of the conscience here as the accuser when people live contrary to what they instinctively know to be true. Paul further explains that the advantage of the Jews believe they have with God because of ethnicity is not true. Those who obey the law of God are the real Jews, he writes. In fact, in verse 25, he writes, 25 through 27, circumcision has value if you observe the law, but if you break the law, you have become as though you have not been circumcised. So then, if those who are not circumcised keep the law's requirements, will they not be regarded as though they were circumcised? The one who is not circumcised physically and yet obeys the law will condemn you, even though you have the written code in circumcision and are a lawbreaker. In other words, physical circumcision is irrelevant. What really matters, because you can be circumcised and not be consistent, or not be right with God. Their thinking was if you were circumcised, that kind of meant that you were by default keeping the law of God. And he says, no, you're not. You're not keeping it. And just the fact that you're circumcised doesn't mean that you have kept it. Because what matters is faith. Going through some physical act of being circumcised doesn't mean anything. And Paul understood, and he's going to get to it later, that keeping the law is impossible. And you're never going to earn God's approval. As hard as you try, you'll never earn it. All you can do is receive it. And you receive it through faith in Jesus Christ alone. And so Paul wraps it up by saying the true Jew, Paul writes, is not a Jew because of outward circumcision, but those who have a circumcision of the heart. And so in verse 28 and 29, he says, a person is not a Jew who is one only outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is circumcision of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the written code. Such a person's praise is not from other people, but from God. So, that's chapter 2. Chapter 1 explains the universal problem. Chapter 2 explains why nobody has a pass on the universal problem and should sit in judgment of other people they think are less spiritual than they are, because we're all guilty. And in fact, though he doesn't call out his fellow Jewish brethren here, that's more likely who he had in mind, because he is going to call them out later. And the point being, not that he's trying to be hateful, and not that he's trying to discredit the law. But what he's saying is possessing the law doesn't mean anything. I mean, I could go down to the state trooper office and get a book on how to drive. And I can keep that book on how to drive in my car, but that doesn't mean I'm going to be a good driver. And that's the same with the law. He said, you can keep the written law around your house. You can do like those who used to put it on their forehead. You can wear it on a t-shirt. It doesn't matter. But if you're not doing it, it's irrelevant. And the fact of the matter is, even if you try to do it, you're not going to be successful. Because the fallen nature, as he'll say later on, will not, which is an act of the will, and cannot, which has to do with the ability, the capacity to do it, will not and cannot submit to the law of God. So you will never, ever be good enough to earn God's approval. Now, does that mean we should just forget about the law and just go sin all we want to? No. In fact, Paul's going to deal with that in many places about the fact and John does too, that we should not continue sinning. So we're not talking about throwing it out. Paul's going to clarify that when he says the real purpose of the law is not to make you right with God, but to show how not right with God you really are. So there's chapter 2. He's revealing the problem. If you'll remember his formula, reveal the problem first and then unveil the solution. Otherwise, the solution makes no sense and has no value. So hang in there. Go ahead and read chapter 3, and I'll give us our little review video in chapter 3. Have a good day.